All right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We will, rather than wait too much longer for students to show up, I think it's time for us to get started. Welcome to the Office for the Advancement of Research's first book talk for the spring semester. Today's talk is featuring the book 60 Miles Upriver, Gentrification and Race in a Small American City by Dr. Richard E. Ocejo of our own sociology department. Dr. Ocejo is a professor of sociology at John Jay, here at John Jay, and at the Graduate Center. He's the author or editor of 5 books, including 60 Miles Upriver, Masters of Craft, Upscaling Downtown, and other books. Ocejo's work has appeared in journals such as Social Problems, Urban Affairs Review, Journal of Urban Affairs, Sociological Perspectives, City and Community, and others. He's the editor of City and Community, the official journal of the Community and Urban Sociology section of the American Sociological Association, and serves on the editorial boards of the journals Work and Occupation, Metropolitics, and the Journal for Undergraduate Ethnography. Finally, he's the director of the MA program in International Migration Studies at the CUNY Graduate Center. Dr. Ocejo is joined today by our discussant, Dr. Brandi T. Summers, who is Associate Professor of African American and African Diaspora Studies and Director of Graduate Studies at Columbia University. Her research examines the relationship between race, space, urban infrastructure, and architecture. 60 Miles Upriver is a book that looks at housing market trends and other issues in a city that is very close to my heart, Newburgh, New York, across the river from where I live in Beacon. As the housing markets of large cities become too expensive for even the middle class, many urbanites are bypassing the suburbs and moving to smaller cities with more affordable real estate and diverse populations, initiating gentrification processes, guilty as charged. Based on the case of Newburgh, a post-industrial city of some 28,000 people located 60 miles north of New York City in the Hudson River Valley, 60 Miles Upriver is about what happens when white creative professionals seek out racially diverse and working-class communities in small urban contexts. It explores a fundamental moral problem at the heart of gentrification, namely that supporters of the process both appreciate racial and social class diversity and recognize that their actions put these groups at risk of displacement. Welcome, Dr. Ocejo.
All right. Thank you, Dan. Thank you for that intro. Thank you, Brandi, for coming and for being a discussant here. So thank you all. Thank you all for coming. This is really, really awesome to be doing this. So today, as Dan mentioned, I'm going to be speaking about my recent book, which was published last spring. Then we're gonna chat a little bit, and then I look forward to hearing your thoughts for the Q&A. All right. One more. All right, we have Remy doing the slides. I want to thank her for doing that. Thank you. All right, so from even before the pandemic, large cities and urban metros have been losing population as well as middle-class population share, largely due to the national housing crisis, and small cities, towns, and rural areas have been gaining population in the aggregate at higher rates than many denser inner-ring suburbs. These places have more affordable housing markets, and economic shifts and changes in labor arrangements, like an increase in remote work, have made them viable destinations for the priced-out urban middle class. So these small places that have been depopulating and disinvested for decades, when we think about them, we think how increases in population and investment, these are typically seen as positive things. However, this means that we are increasingly seeing these smaller municipalities gentrify, putting their vulnerable residents at risk of displacement and of community disruption from sudden influxes of people and investment. But the theories we have of gentrification are based on large cities, which are typically the model cases for most urban theory. Small cities present different conditions that distinguish them from large cities, namely the scale and composition of their populations, their neighborhoods, their economies, their governments. So we need to rethink how we study gentrification that takes spatial scale into account. So my book does this by focusing on a specific dimension of gentrification that is made more pertinent in the context of a small city compared to large cities. And this dimension concerns a moral problem that lies at the heart of the process. So on the one hand, gentrifiers appreciate living among ethno-racial minority and working class communities. That is an appreciation of diversity. And on the other hand, they recognize that the process that they are a part of puts those groups at risk of displacement. Now, racial difference between gentrifiers and these existing residents who they would potentially displace only ends up compounding this moral problem. So this concern, this moral concern, it emerges in any gentrifying context, but I argue that the distinct place characteristics of small cities make it more pronounced and strengthen the need for gentrifiers to have to grapple and resolve it. In small cities, gentrifiers are closer to the process's advancement and have the opportunity to become influential decision makers at the level of city government to shape how it unfolds. I'll get into that later. So this means we need to examine people's attitudes and actions toward the process if we are to understand how gentrification is distinct in small cities. So the book asks, you're good, just leave. The book asks, so when gentrification stakeholders, that is, the people who have invested in the process, who support it, and who stand to benefit from it directly, when these folks know about the process's potential harms toward vulnerable minority groups, what explains their attitudes and behaviors toward it? How do conditions in small cities structure these reactions and the process? And when racial difference is a factor, what roles do racial meanings play in how stakeholders make sense of gentrification in a small city? So this book examines the moral frameworks that people construct to reframe gentrification as a positive or good process, to justify and help advance it, and to criticize those actors who they feel impede the city's potential to grow. It considers how these groups navigate race and deploy racial discourses in a city with a majority-minority population to suit their social class interests and cultural tastes. And the book argues that when small cities revitalize through gentrification, the social and economic stakeholders in the process end up occupying powerful roles that lead them to morally justify their actions, which includes accounting for social difference, especially race, in fundamentally self-serving ways. All right, so here's how my talk will proceed. I just introduced the thing, so we can move right past that. Next, I'll talk about the case and the methods I use for this book. We're going to talk a little bit of theory. Don't worry, I'll walk you through it. I'm going to present some data from one of my chapters, and then I'll conclude the thing. All right, so to make this a little more concrete here, so the city I studied, as Dan mentioned, is a place called Newburgh. It is, well, like the title, 60 miles north of New York City. It's in a very scenic region of New York State, the mid-Hudson River Valley. It's indicated here on the map, this blue and red little icon, surrounded by many other municipalities that make up New York City's northern metropolitan area border. Newburgh itself is roughly square-shaped. It's 4 square miles. It has a population of about 28,000 people, and it stands out in the region for 2 reasons. For one, for being really distinctly urban in a very kind of classical industrial urban sense. It has a high population density, a gridded street pattern, and very strong industrial legacies. And second, it stands out for having a majority-minority population in an area where most municipalities are majority white. So Newburgh's racial breakdown, it's 80% non-white, about 50% Hispanic, 30% black, and only 17% non-Hispanic white. More on Newburgh in a moment here. So I want to just quickly discuss the methods I did for this project. So I started it in February 2017, finished in 2021 of April. So that was almost 4-year anniversary coming up. That asterisk means that last year was obviously the pandemic. My visits to the city were quite sporadic. Most of it was done online. Primarily data collection techniques here. with field work and interviewing, the field work, regular visits to Newburgh, spending time at public gathering places, city government meetings and so on, community meetings, volunteering for a variety of groups. I should mention I do not live in Newburgh. I live in another place about 15 minutes away. And I did in-depth formal interviewing with 144 people. It's kind of rough to categorize people for this study for the sake of clarity. This is the rough breakdown based on where people primarily fit in the analysis. There's a lot of overlap there. All right, so quick history here about the city. One more. So Newburgh was a successful industrial manufacturing city for much of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th. Became very famous for its architecture. Anybody who is familiar with 19th century classical American architecture already knows about Newburgh. The Hudson River at the top part of the photo here connects, obviously, Newburgh to New York City for the shipment of goods, and the waterfront shown in the photo here was always Newburgh's economic heart, its downtown, its engine. But then we see these three major processes of disinvestments in the mid-20th century that lead to the city's decline. First, we have deindustrialization, this being the fleet. No, go back. That was a mistake. I do stuff with my hands. I'm sorry. You'll know when you'll know. All right. Deindustrialization, or the fleeing of manufacturing businesses and jobs and so on. Second, we have the fleeing of white residents and businesses and homeowners to new suburban homes within the region. And in reaction to black migrants from the rural South who were moving in and being segregated into the old, declining, disinvested sections of the city by the waterfront. This is being part of the Great Migration process. And third was urban renewal. This was the federal program of giving municipalities funding for the demolition of existing buildings and street patterns across the country for the purpose of redevelopment around the late 1940s to the early 1970s or so this took place. So in Newburgh, the city destroyed approximately 1,330 buildings in the downtown waterfront area. This is about 10% of its entire building stock at the time. City leaders and their consultants drew their urban renewal maps around what was then the city's predominant black area, and 85% of residents slated to be displaced were black. The plans to redevelop the land mostly fell through, and much of this land remains vacant today. There's just a small little section of it. So Newburgh's decline was very severe. We have rates of poverty, crime, housing insecurity, property abandonment, property neglect all skyrocket. Historic preservationists managed to create a large historic district from the remaining classical architecture. It's the second largest contiguous historic district in the state. Beginning in the 1990s, Newburgh becomes a new destination or a non-traditional gateway city for international migrant groups, primarily from Latin America, which repopulated the city and stabilized many of its streets and its schools. But by the 2010s, it becomes known as the murder capital of New York, based on its per capita murder rate at the time. This was in 2011. Its poverty rate today is approximately 25%, more than double the national average. And 61% of renters and 44% of homeowners are considered cost burdened in their housing, meaning they pay at least a third of their gross monthly income on housing costs. This is in a city in which 69% of households are renters. And these conditions they're especially severe for the city's racial minority population. And yet, despite these decades of decline, Newburgh is now home to a gentrifying historic district where an influx of mostly white creative professionals and cool amenities and events and an expanding creative economy could be found. So we have to ask then, how can we situate this place in the literature? Okay, let's talk theory, one more. So I want to start by briefly going over what do we know about urban political economy and small cities, all right? So urban scholarship has looked at this question of how small cities address the same imperative for economic growth as large ones do, except with far fewer resources at their disposal. And what do we mean by that? They tend to have fewer talented workers or businesses, a smaller tax base, a depreciated real estate market, a less diverse population, fewer amenities and cultural attractions, all things that we've seen large cities do to try to revitalize. But we've seen examples in small cities of revitalization through various strategies like downtown and waterfront redevelopment, Main Street redevelopment, the efforts of anchor institutions such as universities or museums, economic restructurings, such as around tourism, or the construction of large-scale projects such as sports stadiums or casinos. These have all been attempted in other places, but these all fall short in explaining what happened in Newburgh, where these strategies either failed, were insufficient, or were never even attempted. Instead, what we see in Newburgh is a revitalization through gentrification within a city region, as priced out people from New York City are moving there. But as I mentioned, gentrification in small cities needs stronger theoretical development. And I argue that because of their distinct spatial conditions based on scale, the process is unfolding in small cities differently from in large ones because of three interrelated dimensions. First, small city gentrifiers are primarily homeowners, and many are also landlords, business owners, investors, and small-scale developers. And even though they're small scale, collectively they become influential placemakers where they move to. Unlike in large cities, where the early stages of gentrification are usually consisting of much smaller scale individuals, in small cities, we see this more advanced levels of property investment and development from incoming residents early on in the process who are in an immediate position to exert financial power on space. Second, because of high homeownership and the number, the scale, and the intimacy of their gentrifying neighborhoods, we see small cities present greater motivation and opportunities for people who share social class interests and are also invested in a gentrification process to interact and form pro-growth coalitions. Specifically, gentrifiers can find common ground and align with a segment of a small city's existing middle-class residents who are also property and business owners to help further gentrification along. Some of these residents are lifelong, people who never left the city or the region despite a shrinking economy, and others are returning residents or people who grew up in a place, leave for a significant amount of time, such as for college or work, and then return for reasons like living closer to family, housing affordability, and often for the opportunity to contribute to the revitalization of their hometowns. So these groups with local ties have all been long wanting to see Newburgh revitalize, recognize its potential to finally do so because of gentrification and an expanding cultural economy, and they embrace newcomers, help socialize them into the civic and political life of the city. So it's this rare alignment between gentrifiers, newcomers, and existing residents that we typically don't see in large urban contexts. And a third difference, and I would argue this is the one that kind of brings the others together, this is the idea that people in these growth coalitions get civically and politically involved in the city at both the neighborhood and the municipal level. This is also unlike in large cities where gentrifiers can have very little influence on the larger municipal context. At best, they can make changes within a neighborhood context or even a street context. So this includes starting community groups in a small city, regularly attending, participating in government meetings, and even more direct forms of engagement. So Newburgh's small scale gives residents opportunities to occupy influential decision-making roles in city government bodies, official roles within them. Examples include roles in zoning, economic development, historic preservation, arts and culture, and their efforts in city government have been directed toward advancing the process. So in these three ways, we see how small cities place characteristics of housing affordability, opportunities for coalition building, and municipal access structure how the process unfolds by shaping the economic, social, and political dynamics that are at play in the city. So these reorganized dynamics give groups of privileged, mobile residents greater opportunities to effectively exert economic and political power at multiple levels in the city. So I also argue that small cities structure how gentrifiers react to the dimension of gentrification that deals with the process's moral concerns. And this brings us back to the book's central puzzle of how do these gentrification stakeholders reconcile appreciating diversity while knowing that the strength of their embrace may be putting it at risk of displacement? And how do they do so while navigating the sensitive topic of race and racial difference? So moral, as I use it in the book, refers to the shared meanings of right and wrong that motivate people's behavior and shape their ideas and choices. So moral attitudes have factored into gentrification analyses in two key ways. The first deals with this question of who a gentrifying neighborhood should be for, whose principles concerning right and wrong behavior or right and wrong use get to shape the space, place, and community of a gentrifying neighborhood. And research in this tradition tends to look at competing definitions of moral behavior in neighborhoods and the tensions that arise from them. And the second way is through analyses of how gentrifiers make moral sense of the process and their role within it. These tend to focus on more of the internal moral struggles that people feel from choosing to move to a lower income neighborhood, and the rhetorical strategies they deploy to distance themselves from blame. So the idea of assigning people into categories of good versus bad gentrifier, or pinning blame onto larger scale actors such as real estate actors or business actors, or we see in some work like Brown Saraceno's work, the idea of virtuous marginality, of figuring out a way to somehow distance yourself from anything that's advancing the process. But unexplained here is how gentrifiers resolve these moral questions when they are the powerful property-owning actors who want to see gentrification advanced and who have the collective power to advance it as part of a growth coalition with access to municipal government. So the book argues that Newburgh's gentrification stakeholders take a different approach to this moral dilemma from these existing studies. They reframe the process as morally good because it can have equitable impacts and provide a variety of economic and cultural opportunities that will help realize the city's potential to revitalize, to reduce poverty, and to prevent the residential displacement of vulnerable groups. These opportunities include employment in the creative and service economy, improved historic housing, and a better quality of life from exposure to art and culture. And I refer in the book to this orientation as the moral frame of opportunity that assigns value to those actors and actions that promote gentrification's advancement and removes it from those who impede it. This moral attitude also incites civic and political behavior. Possessors of this orientation work toward bolstering the relationship between real estate and the cultural economy, and work against efforts that they feel would limit gentrification, such as the building of new affordable housing, an example I'll get to in a moment. So because of the clear racial differences between stakeholders and existing residents in Newburgh, justifying gentrification by reframing it as morally good also entails navigating and invoking race through two racial discourses between which the emphasis of race's salience shifts. So first, they use more of a diversity discourse that lauds racial difference when it can be repackaged as diversity. Under this discourse, the idea that Newburgh is diverse is both a description and a moralistic statement that reinforces living among racial difference as a normative value. And second, they also use a colorblind racial discourse, in this case to justify gentrification as morally good for providing opportunity. So by asserting that gentrification has the potential to benefit all residents, they reframe the process as a race-neutral form of equitable economic revitalization and cultural exposure, instead of as a racial process that was initiated in a context of racial inequality, one that is linked to the escalation of property values, and one that potentially excludes and displaces racial minority groups. So the structures of inequality that make gentrification a controversial process in the first place all remain intact within these discourses. These discourses also ignore the realities of racism and the real spatial problems that racial minority groups in Newburgh face. Race gets both repackaged as positive diversity to revalorize urban space and to aid gentrification along, and race and racism get rendered invisible when framing gentrification as equitable and opportunity granting. So by shifting race's salience, these discourses help stakeholders both promote place-based diversity and to frame gentrification in equitable and not harmful terms. All right, you with me? Yes. You feeling good? You ready for the data? Yes. All right, thank you. Here we go, next one. All right, real quick, because you're gonna get the book, but if you don't get it, you don't know it yet, I'm gonna just do a real breakdown of the chapters. Brandi, would you do me a favor? Would you hand me that water bottle over there? Yeah, I forgot to carry it over here. Thank you very much. All right. So chapter one, in chapter one that I examine gentrifiers' motivations for moving to Newburgh, and their settlement narratives to kind of show how they use this more diversity discourse to make sense of the city as they would call it a more of a real urban environment. Chapter 2 looks at those lifelong and returning residents who really help facilitate gentrification. These are those existing middle-class residents I talked about. Chapter 3 then analyzes existing residents of color and their advocates who hold more of an ambivalent attitude toward gentrification. Chapter 4 is one I'm going to focus on a bit now. And then Chapter 5 examines more of the actions behind how these stakeholders produce space to suit their interests. I'm going to refer also to Chapter 6, which looks more in depth at a specific case of protesting an affordable housing project. So let me get into these chapters now. Okay. So, you can go again. All right, so there's a need for this moral orientation for a couple of reasons. So just to recap here, they can't shift moral blame for gentrification's harms onto more powerful actors because they are structurally positioned as these more producers of space. And second, they're very conscious of this moral dilemma of displacing people, the groups who they appreciate and the conditions that they like, because of the racial difference and the power disparities between them and existing groups. So Billy, a 35-year-old furniture maker, highlights this concern. Quote, "I'd love to be able to have a storefront or a gallery that's open a few days a week. And it's not just my stuff, but a few other people's stuff. But there's a huge dilemma because nobody in town will be able to afford that, and I know it. If I want to do something that benefits the community and those people around me, it's going to have to be something that's actually more hands-on, like come to the shop, learn something, be exposed to something you wouldn't be otherwise, perhaps. I would have a really hard time opening up a storefront and then being like, here's a $12,000 credenza, like it's kind of a slap in the face," close quote. So as Billy hints at here, the primary way that these stakeholders try to resolve this dilemma is by reframing gentrification as beneficial. So within this frame, they, as gentrifiers, are morally good for being the providers of opportunity. In this case, doing something hands-on that offers exposure within a furniture shop. And we see how this moral orientation stems from their social class status as property and business owners, as well as their occupation as creative professionals. So as a quick example, I'm going to read a shortened version of an episode from my field notes. This actually starts the book. It's not in Chapter 4, but it connects to these themes. "A few blocks past the most gentrified section of the historic district is Lodger," shown in this photo, a supper club-style restaurant with an underground, modern bohemian vibe that has become popular for newcomers. Lodger participates in an internship program with Newburgh's only public high school. The owner selected 3 students for his first cohort, 2 14-year-old ninth graders who identify as Black and Latino, respectively, and a 15-year-old Latina in the 10th grade. All 3 were aware of the new shops and businesses in the gentrifying historic district before their internship at Lodger, but they had never been inside them. Word about the internship at Lodger spread among Newburghers who are in the know about the happenings in the historic district. Since the program began in September, many of them have been coming by to check it out and meet the students. On a Thursday morning in October, a newcomer named Scotty pays a visit to their weekly session. Scotty's a 42-year-old photographer. He moved to Newburgh in Manhattan in 2015. He'd been aware of the city's reputation for crime and poverty, but was not deterred. Like other newcomers, he was drawn to its historic architecture, creative scene, and authentic city feel. "So, are you all interested in becoming chefs one day?" Scotty asks the students after they put on their aprons and set up their cutting boards. The students exchange nervous looks. Smiling shyly, one responds, "I'm really not sure." As the months go by, a steady stream of visitors pop in on the internship sessions. The students grow accustomed to fielding questions like Scotty's about what the internship might lead to. One morning in February, Mary, a 46-year-old clothing and textile designer, comes in to drop off some cloth napkins the owner bartered for. After chatting with him for a bit, Mary stands to the side and observes the students as they chop onions. "Wow, this is really great," she says. "You guys could get jobs at the Bistro," referring to the trendy restaurants in the thick of the district's most gentrified section. The students were recently given a lesson in knife skills by its chef owner and toured its professional kitchen. As the weather warms, Lodger starts opening for lunch on Thursdays. Phil, a 52-year-old vintage furniture restorer and regular diner at Lodger, comes in from his nearby studio. He compliments the students on the soup they've helped prepare. "How do you plan on using these skills going forward?" he asks them between spoonfuls. So throughout the year, newcomers to Newburgh, as well as members of the local press, come in to see the program or to have lunch. They invariably ask the students if they plan to use their experience at Lodger to work in the food industry, often mentioning Newburgh's new restaurants as possible landing spots. For their part, the students provide the same polite answers of non-commitment or uninterest. So we see in this story here one of the key aspects of this moral frame of opportunity I talk about. So to reframe gentrification as beneficial, stakeholders assign value to themselves and their businesses for providing opportunities for existing youth of color. In this vignette, we see newcomers position Lodger's school internship as a career path opportunity for Newburgh's youth, providing the possibility of low-skill training and employment in gentrifier-led businesses becomes a way of justifying gentrification as positive. The reason for the justification, namely the possibilities of displacement due to escalating housing costs, become hidden, while the labor needs of gentrifier-led businesses get repackaged as opportunities. So since they're familiar with gentrification, stakeholders are aware that the process has not benefited low-income residents in other places. Precarious work and art and cultural attractions have not prevented displacement in large cities or unaffordable housing conditions, and these folks are mindful of reproducing inequalities. But they contrast how the process unfolds in large cities compared to small cities by citing their control over it. So Timothy, a 51-year-old sculptor, says of a warehouse building that was renovated for artist studios and artisanal manufacturing, quote, "It's not like Disneyland came to town. A cultural institution can bring a lot just by its presence. Even if it's not a direct economic engine, the ripple effect is the mere presence of something. This is a cool public arts institution that's potentially really great for a community, and it attracts other people who are like-minded, values aligned, who want great things for a community. We can make something happen here and be actively engaged in a process of renewal," close quote. So stakeholders are claiming to be able to control the process and to advance it gradually. As Timothy suggests, they link their own economic needs and cultural interests with the economic needs and the interests of the city and its residents, with one participant referring to the city's gentrification as a model of urban revitalization through craft. Their vision of Newburgh is of what I call just a conditional gentrification, a positive market-driven process based on the cultural economy that they control. So as I document elsewhere in the book, and as we've seen in many other studies, existing residents of color in Newburgh do not necessarily share their interests or recognize activities in the cultural economy as equitable opportunities being provided for them. They're also much more likely to make sense of gentrification in more highly racial terms rather than race-neutral ones. But central to the moral framework I'm outlining here is that these opportunities are available for these groups to take advantage of, not what their outcomes or reception might be. So while racial difference is both a selling point for Newburgh when repackaged as diversity and a key trigger for this moral dilemma, it becomes muted when gentrification stakeholders discuss these opportunities because they're seen as inclusive to all and of universal benefit. So I should mention before I continue that gentrifiers are not, in Newburgh, they're not a monolithic group. The book shows a lot of variation among them. There are many cases of folks who do not possess this moral orientation, who are much more critical of gentrification, who are much more race conscious, who even resist the process, and who are more supportive of low-income people of color. Most folks in my sample, I would say, did respond to it with some version of this justification. So the moral frame of opportunity, this is the last point I'll make, has a flip side to it, and it frames other actors, especially city government officials and a constellation of actors in what stakeholders refer to derogatorily as the poverty industry, people within the nonprofit sector, people within religious institutions, framing these folks as being morally wrong for impeding Newburgh's progress and standing in the way of advancing gentrification. So as Ralph, a blues trumpeter, says, the biggest problem, go back one. Thank you. The biggest problem in Newburgh today, and it's been its biggest problem for decades, is city government. City council lacks self-esteem. The poverty that is here has a certain mentality in the way that politics run and the way things are funded. Government here has issues with trying to get things moved forward, close quote. So the perspective is that Newburgh's legacies from the past and special interests like those within the nonprofit community continue to guide policy decisions in the face of a time of change. So city leaders seen as being somehow stuck or sometimes framed as being incompetent for not realizing this. So this moral framing also gets used to critique specific types of projects and to advocate for other types of projects. So Walter, a luthier, says this about an affordable housing complex run by a nonprofit that was established around the time he moved to Newburgh. Quote, "People made a lot of money on that project. It's unfortunate that you basically have a halfway house on the most prime location in the city. It's not exactly the best use, but that was the only kind of thing going back then. Today, it is not what Newburgh needs. It doesn't need low-income housing," close quote. So the action around a proposed subsidized affordable housing development in the historic district makes up the entirety of Chapter 6. It's in this chapter that we see this moral frame of opportunity in action. So as Walter touches on in that quote, the argument is that developments in the gentrifying historic district that would pay anything less than maximum market rate and maximum taxes are squandering potential property value and revenue and not advancing gentrification, which has been, again, reframed as positive. So stakeholders in this case, therefore, they organized and protested this development and succeeded in getting it rejected. So on the one hand, we see that they're using these more NIMBYist tactics, but their moral orientation also guided them in then joining and even starting public bodies and effectively advancing other market-based and cultural-oriented projects in the historic district. So the small city structures how NIMBYism, this not in my backyard idea of protesting unwanted projects, and how it can operate alongside pro-development or YIMBYism, yes in my backyard, all within this more colorblind moral framework. So gentrifiers' moral framing positions gentrification as a possible alternative path for addressing Newburgh's structural problems. Francis, a cafe owner, says at a budget meeting, "The new people coming in," quote, or to quote, "the new people coming in and the new business coming in and this new influx of people and money and interest and courage is happening very much in spite of what the city has done over the years. The city has had a vision that is counterproductive to a vision of increasing our revenues and our value. It goes exactly in the opposite direction. And that is what needs to change as far as the government is concerned. I think there are enough people who currently live in the city who have ideas of what can be done to grow revenue in a way that does not gentrify in a negative fashion, but does add revenue and growth to the city," close quote. So by not supporting this vision, city leaders fall within the moral framework as obstructing what is framed as being natural or even inevitable progress for the city. So with that, let me just offer some concluding thoughts. One more. So let me just talk about 3 contributions I want this book to hopefully be making. So first, I want to show how spatial scales are integral to how urban processes like gentrification-led revitalization and displacement unfold, and thereby what inequality looks like across differently sized spaces and even within regions. So gentrification in small cities, like I mentioned, features social and political dynamics, very distinct from large ones, particularly how these small-scale, stakeholder-led growth coalitions are able to exert power at the city level. And housing unaffordability, if we look at this regionally, housing unaffordability and displacement in Newburgh cannot be understood without considering housing unaffordability and displacement in New York City and in the larger metro area. So as we see an increasing number of middle-class residents moving to smaller municipalities, this means we're going to have to refine theories that center large urban contexts as model cases and to consider what spatial scale means for understanding inequality. So second, no, keep it, this is good. Second, it furthers the idea that gentrification is a moral process by deepening analyses into the motivations behind it and how it gets set in motion and how it even gets justified. So in this case, we see how essential elements of a process that is seen as controversial get repackaged as positive and beneficial without addressing their potential harms. So I hope this book opens up conversations about the moral implications behind people's housing choices and their local civic actions, and about the responsibilities that people have toward existing residents in the communities they move to, especially when power imbalances such as those of social class and race are in play. And finally, it furthers research into how race is central to gentrification by showing how racial discourses get invoked as both signifiers of spatial value and as justifications and defenses against the process's potential harms. So gentrification typically characterized as a social class process, which it is by definition, but this book shows the key role that racial meanings play in the process beyond the interracial conflicts between groups that emerge in many gentrifying places, as important and crucial as those studies are. So the book addresses more larger questions like, can the same structural forces that help create a decline, in this case poverty and disinvestment, reverse it without acknowledging and addressing their inherent problems of inequality and racism? It challenges the idea that a dominant group can put their needs and interests at the center of a revitalization and achieve equitable results without any kind of mitigating interventions or addressing the structures of inequality that are still in place. With that, I'm gonna finish. You've been a lovely audience. And now we're gonna, thank you. And now we're gonna chat, I guess, right? We're gonna chat. All right. I'm gonna sit down now.
Hello. Oh, there it goes, yes. So yours.
Sorry.
Thank you again, everyone. I guess I'm not a host, I'm a guest too. So I still appreciate everyone for sticking around. And I want to again congratulate Rich on a wonderful
Thank you.
new book and presentation. Thank you. So how are we going to do this? I have a few categories of questions. Part of it, what matters is how many students are in the audience, and I'm not sure. And I do want to ask you questions that are related specifically to doing the research. And so I'll start there, actually. Sometimes it's hard, especially for graduate students, to figure out after reading an academic text, well, how did they do this, right? You can have large block quotes or just, be able to pull from some of the folks that you were speaking to. And though they're probably anonymized and you may still have relationships with them, it's still really difficult sometimes to figure out how to go from theory to method and back again. So can you talk a little bit more about how you incorporated the words of the folks that you spoke with, and how you really kind of structure a manuscript around the kind of ethnographic work that you've done here?
Yeah, thanks for that question. That's a good one. I don't think I've ever been asked that one. That's really good. Okay. So the real simple answer is that when you come up with like the quotes you're going to be using, and I hope some of them were vivid that I got to use, is that they're all serving some larger point that I'm trying to make. And that's already been sorted out. That's already been analyzed. I already kind of figured out what the argument is and what the points are that are going to flow from that argument, that are going to support that argument. And then when it comes time to actually writing it up, then it's kind of picking the quote that's, I got to admit, like the juiciest quote, or the quote that's going to make the point or that's going to support the point the best, but in a manner that's going to be vivid, that's going to be entertaining, that's going to, draw a reader in a little bit more, right? That's going to be very expository. So that's kind of the finishing touches in a way, right? Once I get to the point where I'm picking which quote is going to represent the point that I'm going to make, it's kind of already done. This is sort of like, the icing and the garnish and the last touches that you put on the dish, right? That you're making, But then you have to show it to people. So that becomes part of it. So some people, like Brandi mentioned, most people are anonymized in the book. So I use pseudonyms for most people. But there's about, 12 to 15 or so whose real names I use. And the reason for that is that masking those folks would not have made any sense. It's a small city, right? Obviously, we're not talking about large numbers of people here when we talk about the people who are part of this process that I'm describing in the book. So I can't mask everybody. It would be too obvious, or I would have to change it to such a degree that we're getting way too far away from the actual, realities on the ground. So in those cases, I would show them the quotes or their depiction, or like the example of Lodger that I read, for instance. So in the book, Lodger's the real name of the place, and I talk about the owner. I didn't include the owner in this, but in the book I do. So you have to show, I would bring the texts that they are in, the excerpts, to them, let them read it, and then we have a conversation, right? And we talk about, well, their thoughts on it, their thoughts on how they're depicted, the thoughts on the quote that was used, and then the thoughts on the argument and what the book is about. I let them know, here's what the argument of the book is, here's the sort of arc of the argument, here's where in the book you fit, right? This is sort of where your place is in it, and I want to hear their thoughts on it, and that leads to really kind of fruitful conversations. And in some cases, they say, I'm out. I don't want my name being used in this anymore, or they never really agreed to it, so I didn't, that's why I'm talking to them, to get their approval. In which case, like, fine, no problem, I'll just work around it, and I did, And in other cases, it was just a rubber stamp. They're like, yeah, sure, great, whatever, I don't care. They've moved on in life. And then in some cases, maybe 5 out of those 12 to 15, we have really good conversations about the book, about them, and, goes in a little bit more depth into what they try to say. Well, here's what I really meant, that you get that kind of thing. So yeah, it's a fun process.
Yeah,
That's the fun part. I like that part.
I think it's important because oftentimes as sociologists, or really just social scientists, I'm a recovering sociologist. I don't claim this anymore. I know.
You're still
I'm still in it.
You're still in it.
But I think about the ethics and morals and thinking about the morality question as it comes to doing the research. And so because morality is such an important frame in the book, I think it's also important to see how you contend with the morality of producing that kind of research.
Yeah.
And so I think in the case of the book also, that relationship between morality and these conceptions of gentrification upholding diversity was a really interesting tension. It made me think about democracy and capitalism, like how there are ways that people try to hold on to both as if, as if they can exist together, and they can't in a lot of ways, right? So in thinking about, again, this question of morality and making this argument about how you can embrace diversity, you can embrace growth and revitalization, but that means you also have to displace and all these other things. Like, did you come to the project knowing that was the tension, or as you spoke with folks, you learned a little bit more about the nuance of that tension?
It was as I did it. It was as I was doing the research for it. So I hope there are students in here, because I'm about to drop something that I think is really a really cool part of the research process. So I mentioned I moved to the region and didn't know what I was doing next. I didn't know where my project was going to be at all. And we started hanging out, visiting Newburgh, and from that, I noticed that something clearly was happening here. There was a change of some sort going on here. But I didn't know it was going to be a gentrification study. It was just going to be a study of what's going on with small cities in the 21st century. It was really kind of broad. But then I start talking to people, and they start introducing these dilemmas and these topics. They're the ones who were like, I get it, I know, I'm a gentrifier, or I know it's gentrifying, I know, I just left New York City, which is gentrifying like crazy, and I'm up here and I'm part of this now, and I know that's a problem because I'm the homeowner now. And so they really, and I didn't notice this until I started transcribing and reading over the interviews, maybe like 6 months into the project. And then I noticed that they would bring up gentrifier or gentrification or revitalization or some synonym before I even asked them about it. I never asked them the question or didn't have gentrification in my questions, but they brought it up when I would say something like, so tell me what's going on here. Why'd you pick this city? Where do you live? What do you like about this place? Very basic questions to get them to tell me about their experiences in the place and the settlement patterns and so on. And then once they did, I go, oh, okay, so it's gentrifying. Tell me more about that. Or, oh, you're bothered by the fact that you're a gentrifier. Tell me more about that. And then we get into that moral problem that they were grappling with. It was very evident that they were grappling with it themselves on almost like a daily basis, as they lived in this new place, and they had a familiarity with gentrification. They were aware of it. I think it's a household term at this point. I think most people can figure out what its conditions are and what the debates are and what makes it controversial. And they were all just very intimately aware of that. And so they wanted to talk about it. It was something I couldn't really ignore. So that's how the book took shape, really. That's how the focus took shape. They told me it was important to them. So we went with it. right? But you're right, it gets at the morality, democracy, and capitalism are at war with one another in a lot of places, but you really see it here, and you see the way people's positionality within a context shapes how they are going to approach something like that. So these are people who, these are very, I don't know, progressive people politically, right, at a national level, right?
Right.
And they would be, like I said, the NIMBYism idea, the not in my backyard. It's not that they're against affordable housing, it's just not there, right? Just not in the place where they live now, right? Where they are now the stakeholders and the investors. And that's where that moral dilemma really hits home for them, right? In the abstract, sure, we're in favor of that kind of thing. Fewer market forces, more regulation, more permanent affordable housing, great. When it's in a place where you are politically active and civically engaged, when you're invested, when you're, a member of this community in a more permanent way, that really shapes your sort of calculation of how those three things align, So it was really interesting.
So there's something that, and I'm glad you brought up a lot of those elements, because something that I thought about when reading the book was how retro this form of gentrification felt. So if we think about the ways that, if we go with some geographers and sociologists that talk about various waves of gentrification based on a kind of time scale, and knowing that we recognize gentrification in places like New York when the artists come in and places are, it's only affordable to the artists, and they were generally white artists who could only afford these spaces that have been disinvested. They turn it around with their cultural capital, and then, there's this kind of movement, right? And so the fact that you're focusing on small cities, and you said that they don't actually have that infrastructure there like these larger cities and metropolitan areas do. So it's kind of as if they're using an old way of gentrifying in order to bring a positive change to the area. And also identifying structural issues as those that can be addressed by individual forms of investment. So, how are you navigating that kind of relationship to them not only identifying as gentrifiers and recognizing what gentrification was, but honestly using an old version, an original, 40-year-old version of gentrification?
Right. What was fascinating is that I like the retro gentrification. That's a good name. There's somewhere in the book, I think in chapter 1, where I talk about how they make sense of Newburgh. There's a long paragraph in which I just list all the places that they say Newburgh reminds them of. And it gets so specific. There's like 20 neighborhoods in New York City in there. But some get very specific, like reminds me, it's Williamsburg in 1999. Or this reminds me of Soho in the 70s, or the East Village in the 80s, or reminds me of, Greenpoint in the aughts, Some say Chicago, then they say Philly, some say Providence, some say Columbus, Ohio. Wherever they've been where they've seen gentrification or lived among it, Newburgh reminds them of that. So to this point, 100%, right? This is, if you look at that stage model idea, a lot of new gentrification research focuses on the fourth, fifth stages where we're at a point of like the financialization of housing, and we're at a point of really kind of major corporate investment and just a lot of big real estate actors who are involved in housing, right? That's sort of the stage we're at. And in major global metropolises like New York, that's 100% accurate. Those actors are less common in the outskirts, so less common this is happening in these places, but this is less common. They're smaller scale, large actors, I guess, and that is taking place in Newburgh. But I was fascinated by how they made that connection, that what we're doing is kind of an older version of that, but they emphasized that what we're doing is not going to lead to all the problems that are going on in New York City now, right? What they did was it attracted too many of those larger scale corporate actors and the big real estate developers. We're not that. We're just a bunch of mom and pop landlords and investors and business owners who are not gonna make it get out of control and not get it go. And it's a market change, and when that happens, market actors get alerted to it, and there is a real estate investment trust that is operating in Newburgh at the moment. They're called Seraphim Equities. You can invest in it and be an investor in their trust and get a return on your investment at the end of the year. I think they only own about 5% of all rental units in the city right now, their aim is for 30%. So it eventually is going to, it's just the way the market works, right? It's going to attract these larger scale actors who are going to put these processes in place, but they're not going to unfold under those same sort of stages as problematic as those stages are anyway. They're not going to operate in the same exact steps, right? And the same waves are going to happen in consecutive order. But it's going to happen to some degree, right? And it'll be curious to see what that actually looks like in a decade, right?
Yeah, so thank you for that. I want to introduce another area that you focused on quite a bit, not only in your talk, but also in the book, and thinking about race. And the ways that, there was this way that different racial groups seem to have a different kind of relationship to gentrification and whether it was good or bad. So this is a perennial question, but can Black folks be gentrifiers? And if so, how does that show up in your study, especially since there was that breakdown of who was supporting the gentrification, or at least the various practices and the productivity of gentrification in Newburgh.
This is good timing. I just finished rereading Mary Patillo's Black on the Block like a month ago, and this was an excellent book from 2007. It's almost 20 years old now, of Black gentrification of South Chicago. And, she outlines the important role that class has played and plays in these sort of contexts when Black newcomers in the middle class, who are often very closely related in some familiar way or even personally to low-income communities, right? Even if they have achieved upward mobility and have college educated and they're professionals, right? When they moved back to, she documents how when they moved back to North Kenwood, Oakland, is the neighborhood, it's got a strong racial uplift mission to it. There's very strong, we want to help this specific Black community, this specific low-income Black community. We're going to bring resources, we're going to bring investments, we're going to help bring employments, we're going to help our community, right? That we're going to bring the resources that have been lacking in this place. So that's been documented in a lot of same-race gentrification studies, gentrification with Hispanic neighborhoods. We're starting to see that as well. So the Black folks who moved to Newburgh, there are not many, which I found interesting. I kind of thought there would be more because, again, Newburgh's one of the only majority-minority cities, small cities in the Hudson Valley, and it has a very large, by percentage, a very large Black population. I thought more would have been motivated by that. They weren't. The folks the Black gentrifiers, 2 or 3 I interviewed. It's a really small sample size, so I don't focus too much on it. But they weren't motivated by race. They weren't motivated by being close. Once they moved there, then they were really sort of trying to buy into it, trying to find a way into existing communities, like find a new church, or find businesses that they wanted to go to. They made efforts and they tried, but it wasn't a motivation for them to be part of that. But they still understood the process much more in much clearer racial terms. They were less likely to see the positive value of what all this new activity and investment was doing to the people who were there. They tended to see it much more in this kind of this harm frame that this is going, this is probably this is not going to be good. I'm glad I'm here. Hey, maybe it'll work out, but I'm just not seeing it. So yeah, I think. Yeah, no, totally different context from what Mary Patillo was, or what Chicago was all about, or what you studied in DC, right? A very different context, but, and they take a totally different orientation to it, yeah.
That's helpful. And thinking about, because I think it's complicated.
Yeah.
And also to understand the relationship between race and class, especially within the U.S. context. And so I think what's really important here is still to think about scale and recognizing that you're talking about a small city in this post-industrial, thinking about the Hudson Valley, of course, in relationship to New York City is important. But again, the small part, I think, is what matters the most. So even when you were talking about Newburgh being the murder capital of New York, like that's really significant, especially since it was a small city.
Yeah.
And generally speaking, I'm from Oakland, California, and Oakland's been the murder capital of California forever. So knowing that there's an assumption that there's a large Black and brown population in these places because they are seen as violent, and not necessarily thinking about, large-scale disinvestment and all the changes, segregation, et cetera. And so on that, I had a question. I'm sure I have to open it up for questions from the audience, and I am looking at my time, so maybe I'll make this my last one for now. But I was thinking about, you mentioned today, and also it's in the book, poverty. And I mean, poverty is structural, and I think, what's been interesting about reading your book is there are ways that you see research that's been done over the last 20 years has not trickled into various communities to understand when something can be fixed by individuals doing something, or when you have to address structural inequities that have been there for quite a long time, and you have to come up with whether redistribution or social services, a variety of other tools that can really shake up these structural problems. But I'm seeing, again, in the book that the presumption is, well, the city's not doing what it's supposed to do, and they're not, fierce enough to actually attack the problem, when that would require some of the middle-class residents to give up something, quite a bit actually, and it would also require a different industry to be one that's being pulled into Newburgh. So I want to hear more about, I guess it's two things. One, how, I guess, as a scholar, especially around urban studies, especially urban sociology, do you get these lessons, or do you get these contributions to a wider audience outside of showing people their quotes? So that doesn't mean going into public sociology. It means having real impact. Like, we're going to use this because there are so many small cities that are undergoing this process. How do you conceive of doing that work, since it seems as though it's not necessarily landing? Some of the lessons may not be landing. And then secondly, in considering the importance of poverty, especially since we see in the country the distinction, like the difference between wealthy and those experiencing poverty is just at ridiculous scale, right? Where the difference between the two is so significant. So how can we conceive of poverty in this small scale or this small city context in a way that can kind of shape and shift how we talk about gentrification?
Okay, sorry, let me write that down. How can we?
So if we're considering how poverty is structural, and I'm going to assume that you believe that's true.
Yes, I do.
How can we really impact how we think and talk about gentrification when we're considering a smaller scale? I know we do studies on poverty at grand scales, larger scales, but we don't really talk about it on a small scale. So I'm arguing essentially that your book is allowing us to look at these questions differently, and it's actually a contribution because you're looking at a smaller city, and we're still able to kind of negotiate what we mean when we're talking about poverty. So that's what it is.
So thank you, that's great. So the first question here, so the impacts in places and how it's landing, the message is kind of landing, and the fact that the book is pretty clear that it talks about these problems in much more structural terms, and it focuses on people, and it focuses on individuals, but it's always about, this is kind of about the conditions that produce this orientation, the conditions that structure how people come to have to make sense of a problem, and then how they actually do make sense of that problem and what that problem does, right? Or what their reaction to that problem actually ends up doing. So besides the individual talking to people one-on-one, I mean, I've had the opportunity to bring the book to other municipalities that are gentrifying in the Hudson Valley, and it often becomes like a self-selected audience. So it's going to be people who are, say, housing advocates, or it's going to be people who have been conscious and aware of this process in the region for a while, who are usually fighting against it. Or they're people like the folks who I describe in the book, who they're sensitive to it, but they believe this could be a kind of a force for change. And I don't know if it's because I have and I don't know, I don't think I wouldn't describe it necessarily as cynical, but the way I'm trying to make sense of the role that social science knowledge, sociological knowledge is playing today, I wonder if it's less about, this is based on the reactions I get from people, I wonder if it's less about the work we're doing and the efforts that we put in to do public sociology, which is not exactly what you asked, but it's what I've been thinking of. Maybe it's not the effort, maybe it's not how we communicate, maybe it's just the message itself that people just don't want to hear right now, you know? So the people who I expected to push back on what I say in the book are the exact people who have pushed back. And it has nothing to do with the clarity of the arguments or how cogent it is or how I present it, or I'm not aggressive, I'm not attacking people, or I'm making it clear it's a structural thing.
Yeah.
We're all part of it, I'm part of it to a certain, other extents and so on. It really gets the same kind of reaction that I anticipated, and it's people who double down on the arguments that they make on their approach to addressing this problem. So, on the one hand, it's been a good reception. On the other hand, it's kind of been an expected, predictable reception, and I wonder if that's more universal to where we're at now as just politically, right? Like where we're at as a discipline. But when I think the book wants to do this about scale, right? So the book really wants to show, the ways that inequality has to be made sense of spatially, and that includes where it takes place and just what the scale is of the places in which it's embedded. So it's really kind of bringing in scale to studying social facts, which have to be in certain times and places. And, there's been a lot of great work that unfortunately gets ignored too much that's looked at rural poverty, which this work is kind of in between in a way, And that's scale. That's a scalar issue where you have places that are lacking medical services simply because of scale issues that don't fit within economic models of, healthcare industry and profit and so on. So I think of things like displacement and housing costs in smaller contexts. And what's fascinating in small cities compared to large ones is that, this is not quite anecdotal, but it's not a complete quantitative analysis, demographic analysis, but people in smaller municipalities are more likely, based on the research I've seen, to be displaced from the entire municipality, not solely from their neighborhood. So in a large city, there are other neighborhood options because of density and because of economies of scale. You have let's say a nonprofit infrastructure that could address housing issues, or you'll have resources and institutions that are already in place in large cities because they've been there for many decades. They've had this opportunity. It's kind of similar to the new immigrant destination literature that looks at places that lack services for new migrant groups. It's kind of similar when it comes to low-income people and people who live in poverty in small contexts where they have fewer options. There are fewer housing options in a small municipality. People often have to leave the municipality entirely, which means leaving whatever networks they have that are established, which means leaving whatever communities that they're a part of. So, in that case, scale can be even more, in many ways, disruptive to people who are living in poverty than in places like large cities, as destructive as it still is in large cities. There are fewer options, there are fewer resources. So that could only be understood if we make sense of the scale in which people find themselves living in the context they live in, and the region, right? And the scale of the region, the composition of the region, all of these things. If we look at this from those kinds of angles, then I think we reveal a lot more that we assume is more of an urban process based on large urban conditions, when in fact it's a much more universal thing that just needs more calibration, more conceptual calibration to make sense of, to reveal it.
Thank you for
There you
indulging
go.
me. Okay, so let's ask you guys you should ask some questions.
Yeah.
Please, and there's a mic.
There's actually two mics.
There's two mics.
Wow.
So can I ask those who are able to come up to the mics with their questions? And if you're not, raise your hands and we'll bring it to you.
Yeah, you may.
Yes.
Right ahead.
The short question is, hi.
Hi.
And thanks for the talk.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you. The short question is why Newburgh, and the longer question is, so there are deindustrialized small cities up and down the Hudson, right?
Yeah.
And a number of them probably have gentrified more quote unquote successfully than Newburgh, which I think is more resistant to gentrification than other. So why did you choose Newburgh as your case study?
Yeah.
As opposed to any other?
It's a definition of a convenience sample, right? So I tell my students, you know, when we get to the lesson in my methods class on convenience samples, sometimes it's the place that's closest to you and where you want to check it out. So like I said, it wasn't going to be a gentrification study. It was going to be a study on, I didn't know, something about small cities and how they're adjusting and how they're, because I had this idea, of course, that we don't look at these places. These places tend to be ignored by urban sociology, and we've never really theorized them that much, but I wasn't sure if it was going to be gentrification studies. So once I saw that it was going to be, and Newburgh's 15 minutes away from where I live, so that's really the reason why, right? It was this place close by that was really fascinating, that I saw a project there, right? I saw a problem that I could focus on. So deindustrialization in the Hudson Valley, and your question was more about why or what? Yeah.
About that specific location, because there's so many small cities up and down.
Yeah.
That are.
So what's fascinating, when I got into this a bit, so there was a map, or whatever, but the map on there that had the whole Hudson Valley. I don't know how familiar you are with the region, but you're born in Newburgh.
Oh, wow.
So I'm kind of familiar.
You, St. Luke's? St. Luke's?
I was born in St. Louis.
Yeah, you were.
I stand on the train station at Beacon, and we look at where I was born.
Wow.
And my son.
Lovely.
Wow.
All right. So you know this trajectory, right? So the different cities in the Hudson Valley that gentrified, the ones that gentrified first, and the gentrification literature is pretty clear that majority white, low-income neighborhoods tend to gentrify before majority minority gentrifying neighborhoods. And when a non-white majority neighborhood has a population that's dominated by a single group, especially when it's black residents, white gentrifiers will only want to move there if it falls below a certain threshold, and that threshold's typically around 40% of a neighborhood's population. So let's take that and put it in the Hudson Valley. So the municipalities that gentrified first, started gentrifying first in the Hudson Valley, would have been Beacon, Kingston, and Hudson. And those are all majority white cities historically. So they moved first, even though Kingston's way beyond Newburgh. It's not as close to New York City. Beacon makes sense because it's on the train. You could commute there. I get it. Hudson's even farther. And Hudson, fascinating about Hudson, it was mostly second homeowners who went to Hudson. It was a lot wealthier folks, right, who went there. It wasn't until later when Newburgh's historic district reached a population threshold of about 36% black in the historic district when it started to gentrify in the 2010s. And it was over 50% up until the Great Recession. The foreclosure crisis and the housing crisis led to the displacement of black residents in the historic district. It kind of reached a perfect demographic mix, and it had the migrant groups from Latin America moving in who were kind of creating this kind of buffer situation in those neighborhoods. And it kind of eventually got that way where people would eventually move there based on the sort of racial demographics that shifted. So it's fascinating that the places in the Hudson Valley, they all gentrify because they're within the orbit of New York City. New York City's economy structures what happens in the rest of the region. But specific local conditions shaped how, when, and how fast each of those municipalities gentrified on their own, right? And the time order of it, right? So, Beacon obviously, without DIA, Beacon probably doesn't gentrify right away at least, right? But DIA was a massive cultural anchor institution that chose Beacon. Do you know the story of why they chose Beacon? Well, the executive director was flying his plane along the Hudson River to go to the Berkshires. They were going to move to the Berkshires for their second location. He saw the thing, he saw the factory there on the river. He said, what is that? And the Nabisco factory. It's like, what is that? Yeah, box factory, right. And he said to us, he said, what is that? He's like, I don't know. No one knows what that is. It's the Hudson Valley. No one goes here. This is like in 1999 or something like that. And he said, I want to go visit there. That looks fascinating. He went there, he checked it out. They had a progressive mayor at the time who fought city council. They didn't want it. They thought, if you have an empty manufacturing building, what should you put there? Manufacturing. You should put another factory in there to provide employment. He said, no, no, no. You put a museum here, people will come, like a creative class style idea. They'll come from New York City, they'll day trip, they're like, nonsense, it's not on people's mental maps. And he eventually proved right? So they move there and it explodes, they get a Main Street, Beacon's done. Most people who went to Newburgh's looked in Beacon first, the artists, a lot of them, not all of them, a lot of them. And then, like I said, Hudson, second homeowner, completely different model of revitalization. Kingston, also very different, fewer commuters who go there. Kingston's much differently sort of laid out. I don't know enough about Kingston, but it's different history. Peekskill, very different. So it's fascinating that you have all these different places that shaped by their own local conditions, and the decisions that city governments made to attract people to go there. So anyway, yeah. Mark. Oh. Go ahead, yeah. There.
Please share with us what reactions you received from city officials.
Don't know. They haven't talked to me. I do not know. What's that?
Won't they talk to you? Or?
Yeah, I think they would. I think they would. I didn't get to know a lot. The city officials are not in the book much. I want to say elected officials are not in the book much. I interviewed a few of them, but not many. There's one person, he wasn't a city council member by the time the book came out, but he was during most of the research of the book. He reacted pretty favorably to it. He thought it was a fair analysis because elected officials are not treated very well by newcomers. They're not considered to be progressive. They're like the reasons that I gave, right? They're stuck in their ways. They're in bed with, as they put it, slumlords who, there's a lot of negative talk around them. And this one particular city council person who I did get close with as a
Grice, was it
research.
Anthony Grice?
Anthony Grice,
Yeah.
that's right, there he is. I used his name in there, yeah, Anthony Grice, good guy. He agreed with a lot of what I was saying in the book, He pushed back on some things that I would say about what city government did or didn't try to do. That's fine, whatever. But otherwise, not much of a reaction. I've reached out, but not much of a reaction from them.
Hi. Excellent presentation. Thank you.
you.
And thanks for your excellent questions that made me understand it better. I didn't read the book yet, and I will. And I just want to say I teach your work on my courses because of the quality of the writing and its accessibility and the way it can show students it's good role models for how to do this type of research.
Yeah.
Many of these ethnographies about gentrification are about who's moving in. I'm wondering if there's research about who's getting displaced and who's moving out.
Yeah.
And I haven't read your book yet, so I don't know. I'm wondering if your book touched upon who's kind of forced out of the neighborhood, and if that research is out there, because that feels to me like kind of the next step
Yeah.
in thinking about we've criticized who's moving out. What are
Right.
we doing for the people who
Where they go.
who have been
Yeah.
displaced?
I mean, that's like the $1 million question, right? I mean, people have tried to do this work. It's really hard to do because you're looking at people who are no longer there.
How do you find them?
How do you find them, right? So in any work I've done, it's always anecdotal. It's always people who know a family member, they have a friend who got displaced, and I could hunt them down and I could do an interview with them, and we need more systematic research that really examines just really the scope of where people go within a region or outside of a region.
And
that's
respect for the anecdotal.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, you're right. Yeah. And the people, I mean, just to speak this, so like, I mentioned the Great Migration that was in Newburgh, where it was part of the process. And in Newburgh, it was, and I tried to figure this out, how this happened, but it's really, most families came from a single county in North Carolina is Sampson County. Clinton is the county seat, if anybody's familiar, you know. I emailed the county historian and the city historian, and they did not know exactly why people from that specific county moved to Newburgh in such large numbers. But anyway, it was recent enough that many of the families who I interviewed in Newburgh still have family connections in North Carolina, and many had moved back or were moving back or had cousins who had moved back. They would visit in the summers anyway, so they did have familiarity with the place. So there were some cases of that. Then there's some cases of people who moved to just another small city nearby. There's some moved to Albany to take civil service exams and try to get employment at the state level. It's a mix, right? But the question of where people go is what urban scholars who study this stuff have been trying to do with good accuracy for a long time. I think a problem is that we tend to start at the beginning. You know, we focus at the beginning of that process, but since it is a process, the ripple effects can last a decade or more, right? Or they can keep going. So we don't go back, you know, to see who's still there, right? And try to learn a little bit more deeply about where people went, right? What their conditions were, why they went, the motivations behind going. So it's tough.
Some of the folks who are doing work on suburbanization of poverty have talked about how those who are in the suburbs now who didn't have access to the suburbs before
Right.
are going there, and now we have a lot more poverty in the suburbs that existed previously in the city. And so it's that wave of folks who moved from the 90s through the aughts, and that's kind of that group in post-industrial environments. Their jobs, they couldn't live in the city anymore, and so they live further away, and then their commute's higher, and then there's more focus on infrastructure and those kinds of things. But I don't see too many studies that like actually talk to the people. It's more so seeing shifts and how it's impacted the landscape.
Right.
there.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
The-
so not the qualitative work. It's
Right.
more descriptive and general than it is more specific. Yeah.
Right. Right.
Hello,
Hi.
thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
I'm Julie, I live in Newburgh.
Ah,
Yeah, moved there 13 years ago I was from Seattle,
you look familiar.
maybe I saw you. I live about a block from Broadway, so I go to the restaurants and shops all the time. Anyway, I moved from Seattle to go to a graduate course in SVA. I'm an artist. And then after that, I went to Newburgh because I had some friends that were living there, and they said, you should come and see. So I did. And then there was the houses were for sale for such a low price, and I could never live like that in Seattle. You know, I always wanted to get a 3-family or a 4-family home, live in a unit, get the rental income, then I would at least have a base so I don't have to worry, you know,
Yeah.
about work not selling or selling, you know. And so there were a lot of us there at that time, 12 or 13 years ago, and everybody is still there. And some of the artists have managed to buy homes that have other places in them. But, you know, the issues that remain are painful. You could have gone to social services and asked them what happened to some of these buildings on Broadway that were emptied. And, I mean, Seraphin Properties bought 80 places, and they
Sure.
all had to be emptied. And I guess, you know, the rumor is that everybody was squatting and there was drugs all over the place, and I'm sure that was in a few apartments. But we don't know where they went either. Nobody has any idea, but I do understand the South Carolina thing, or North Carolina, because a lot of the people that came to Newburgh to work in the factories when it was booming, they came because somehow the word had gotten around, and
Yeah.
these people from North Carolina came. So they do almost, you know, a great majority of people that I know do have family in North Carolina, and they do end up going back and living with them.
Yeah, and that's
then-
that's a broad sort of reverse Great Migration that's happening across the North. Is
Right.
a return of many black families to the South because of affordability in many cases.
But it's hard in Newburgh because there aren't any jobs.
Right.
There's no employment at all,
Right.
really. I mean, those little restaurants are going
Yeah.
broke right now, and they're going to start off, you know, there'll be a new street that gentrifies. And, but, you know, it's hard living there. I had a homeless guy that was a friend, and I was sort of giving him some locks and wood and stuff so that he could overwinter in the place where he was living on that green hill that
Yeah.
you showed the picture of.
Yeah.
And then he came to my house one day and he said, I'm going to Florida. I got a job in Florida. And it was like, wow, you know, Cartier, you know, stay in Florida. It's better. It's so cold here. And I haven't seen him back yet, but I suspect he will be back. You know, he's from Newburgh, doesn't have any family here any longer, but he's got a bunch of friends. And there's a huge community of people that are homeless, and they talk to each other, and they seem to be able to find these jobs and stuff when
Yeah.
they, you know, when they can. And I know that when people leave, you know, it's very difficult for everybody, you know.
Yeah.
But, you know, I came to Newburgh and I was broke, and I bought the house, and then I slowly fixed it up so I could rent it. And a number of people, almost everybody that came to Newburgh and lives in these gorgeous architectural buildings, mansions. I mean, I live in a mansion.
Yeah.
And I could pay cash for it 13 years ago. And it was $200,000, you know, because I sold a house before I moved, you know, and okay, I was lucky. That's a lot of privilege. But, you know, I couldn't have gotten a loan on the house because it was in such bad shape.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the problem with Newburgh also is that all the homes have been, or had been, just left. The owners ran, and they just left the place, and so people would just go in and live there. You know, there was nobody renting the places. And everything fell into a horrible disrepair. I mean, it was
Yeah.
horrible. And just the other day, it's still going on, because last month, I think it was, or maybe it was last year because it wasn't snowing. I'm walking to meet a friend on this little side street, and there's a woman sort of hanging out of the second floor, and she says, hey, what are you doing? And I said, oh, you know, I'm going to meet a friend. What are you doing? She says, well, I'm trying to figure out how to get these raccoons out of my apartment. I said, raccoons? She says, yeah, they wake me up at night, and they're going to me in my face, and my landlord doesn't do anything about it. You know, I was like, oh, my God, that's horrible. She says, yeah, I know. I've got a bat. I've got to hit them at night, get rid of them. Then I'm afraid they're going to attack me. And I was, you know, walking with a friend, and I said, geez, I wonder if there's anything that we could do. Could we go to the codes department and report that house? And then it was like, no, we can't, because if we do that, she gets the boot. She has nowhere to live,
Right.
you
Yeah,
know?
yeah.
And it's the same thing that the people that are selling drugs on my street, you know? I don't report them. That's an economy. And for some people, it's the only economy that they have. And,
Yeah.
you know, I don't want them to go to jail.
Right.
You know.
Yeah. No, it's
So, but
yeah.
it's hard also because, you know, there's guns around. They've got guns in their cars, you know. There's guns all over the place. So that's also sort of scary, especially for newcomers.
Sure.
You know.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of reason that people would like to see some kind of businesses there and attract a company to come or something like that, which would have employment for people that don't have jobs.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's really a sad
Yeah.
thing, and I don't know if it's going to get any better or any worse for anybody.
Right.
You know.
Well, it's a place that's been struggling with entrenched poverty for many, many decades. Those problems are very visible and evidence. You just described several of them there.
Yeah.
And it becomes this question of, well, how do we address those? What's the right way to address those that's going to be beneficial for the people who are been struggling under these conditions for many decades? That's
Right.
going to allow them to stay in the city where they live in and shape it the way that they want it to be shaped. Yeah. It's a
Anyway,
problem.
Thanks for writing the book.
Thanks
I'm
for
looking
coming.
forward to getting
Thank
a
you for
copy of
coming.
it. Yeah.
Tell your friends.
All right, we are about out
Thank
of
you.
time.
All right.
So thank you so much, Dr. Ocejo and Dr. Summers. And if I may, this is only the first of our three book talks this spring. Let me plug our next two. Our next talk is actually not a talk. It is a live recording of Dr. Kathleen Collins' Indoor Voices podcast. Many of you have presumably guested on that podcast at one time or another. That live recording will be taking place April 2nd at 4:30 p.m. in this very room. Our last book talk of the semester takes place on April 23rd, 4:30 to 6 p.m. in the Moot Court, and that will be Dr. Nathan Lentz, his book, The Sexual Evolution, The Inherent Queerness of Animals. And then there is one other event I've been asked to plug, which is a conversation between President Mason and the Chief Administrative Judge of New York State, the Honorable Joseph Zayas, which is also Wednesday, April 2nd during community hour. So those flyers are on your seats. Thanks again to you all for coming. Thanks, Dr. Ocejo and Dr. Summers. Don't leave any food.